It's a warm summer evening in 2019, and 24-year-old Marcus Williams is in his modest apartment in Oakland, California, working on what would become one of the most powerful songs about racial harassment ever recorded. The melody flowing from his keyboard isn't just music. It's his response to months of targeted harassment from a neighbor who couldn't stand the sight, or sound of a young black man pursuing his dreams. What started as noise complaints quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Racist notes slipped under his door, calls to his landlord demanding his eviction, and eventually, a viral confrontation that would expose the ugly reality of how music, particularly hip-hop, becomes a weapon of racial discrimination in America. But Marcus didn't just endure this harassment. He transformed it into art that would reach millions and spark conversations about racism that continue to this day. This isn't just another story about a musician who made it big. This is about how one young man's refusal to be silenced by hate became a rallying cry for an entire generation facing similar struggles. It's about the power of turning pain into purpose, and how sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from the most toxic soil. Marcus Williams didn't set out to become an activist. He just wanted to make music. But when his neighbor Karen Mitchell decided that his presence in their shared building was unacceptable, she inadvertently created something far more powerful than she could have imagined. A movement wrapped in a melody that would force America to confront an uncomfortable truth about how racism manifests in everyday interactions. This is the story of Karen's Complaint, the hit song that emerged from hate, and the young man who proved that sometimes the best response to discrimination isn't silence, but speaking louder than ever before. Marcus Williams grew up in Richmond, California, in a single-parent household where music was both refuge and rebellion. His mother, Sandra Williams, worked double shifts as a certified nursing assistant to keep their small apartment, but she always made sure Marcus had access to the local community center's music programs. It was there, surrounded by donated keyboards and second-hand recording equipment, that 8-year-old Marcus first discovered his gift for melody and rhythm. Richmond in the 1990s and early 2000s was a city in transition. Once a thriving industrial hub during World War II, it had become synonymous with urban decay and violence by the time Marcus was born. But within this challenging environment, a vibrant artistic community flourished. Local artists like E4O and Too Short had put Bay Area hip-hop on the map, proving that authentic stories from the streets could reach global audiences. For Marcus, these weren't just entertainers. They were proof that young black men from his neighborhood could transform their experiences into something meaningful. Throughout high school, Marcus spent every free moment honing his craft. He learned to play piano, taught himself music production software, and began writing lyrics that reflected the complex reality of growing up black in America. His songs weren't just about hardship. They celebrated resilience, community, and the beauty he found in his everyday life. Teachers noticed his talent, and by senior year, he was performing at school assemblies and local community events. After graduating, Marcus took a gap year to focus entirely on his music, working part-time jobs to afford basic recording equipment. His mother, though worried about the financial uncertainty of a music career, supported his dream. "She always told me that my voice was meant to be heard," Marcus would later recall. "She said God gave me this gift not to hide it under a bushel, but to shine it bright enough for others to find their way." In 2018, at age 23, Marcus finally saved enough money to rent his own apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit in Oakland's Fruitvale district. The neighborhood was gentrifying rapidly, with longtime Latino and Black residents finding themselves priced out by an influx of young tech workers and urban professionals. Marcus's building reflected this demographic shift, a mix of working class families who had lived there for decades alongside newer residents drawn by relatively affordable rent close to downtown San Francisco. The apartment represented everything Marcus had worked toward. For the first time in his life, he had space to create music without worrying about disturbing family members or neighbors in cramped quarters. He invested in better equipment, soundproofed his bedroom as best he could with foam panels and heavy curtains, and established a routine of working on his music, primarily during evening hours when he returned from his day job at a local music store. By this time, Marcus had begun to gain recognition in Oakland's underground hip-hop scene. His songs, which he released independently on streaming platforms, had garnered thousands of plays. He performed regularly at local venues and open mic nights, slowly building a dedicated following. His music was deeply personal tracks about his mother's strength, the challenges of growing up without a father figure, and the daily navigation of being a young black man in America. Critics praised his authentic storytelling and sophisticated production skills, but Marcus's rising profile came with challenges he hadn't anticipated. As his music gained attention online, he faced the familiar struggles that many black artists encounter: questions about whether his music was too real for mainstream audiences, pressure to conform to industry stereotypes about hip-hop artists, and the constant burden of representing his entire community through his art. The racial climate of the late 2010s provided an intense backdrop for Marcus's emerging career. The Black Lives Matter movement had brought national attention to police violence and systemic racism, while the 2016 election had emboldened more overt expressions of racial hostility. For young black artists like Marcus, this environment created both opportunity and danger. Their authentic voices were more needed than ever. But speaking truth about racial injustice often came with personal costs. It was into this charged atmosphere that Marcus moved into his Oakland apartment, hoping to find the peace and space necessary to take his music career to the next level. He had no idea that his greatest challenge, and ultimately his biggest breakthrough, would come not from the music industry, but from the woman living in apartment 2B. Karen Mitchell had lived in apartment 2B for 8 years when Marcus moved into 2A in September 2018. A 47-year-old insurance adjuster who worked remotely, Karen prided herself on maintaining what she called appropriate building standards. She had grown up in suburban Sacramento in an all-white neighborhood and had moved to Oakland for her job, but never quite adjusted to the diversity and vibrancy of urban life. To Karen, Marcus's presence represented everything she found uncomfortable about the changing character of her building and neighborhood. The harassment began subtly, as it often does. 3 weeks after Marcus moved in, Karen left her first note, a typed message slipped under his door at 6 a.m., ostensibly about excessive noise levels during inappropriate hours. Marcus had been practicing with headphones the previous evening, until around 9:30 p.m., well within building quiet hours that began at 10 p.m. The note was signed simply "A Concerned Neighbor," and suggested he consider the impact of his lifestyle choices on others. Marcus initially dismissed the note as a misunderstanding. He had been careful about noise levels, using headphones for most of his practice, and only playing his keyboard speakers at low volumes during acceptable hours. He decided to be even more cautious, switching entirely to headphone practice, except for brief periods in the early evening, when he needed to hear his mixes through speakers to properly balance the sound. But the notes continued. The second one, arriving a week later, was more specific. Your so-called music is disturbing the peace and character of this building. Some of us work for a living and don't appreciate having to listen to your ghetto music all hours of the day. This note was the first to explicitly reference his music's genre, using coded language that Marcus immediately recognized as racially charged. The third note escalated further. If you can't respect your neighbors, maybe you should find somewhere else to live where your kind of music is more appreciated. The phrase "your kind" hit Marcus like a physical blow. There was no longer any ambiguity about what was happening. This wasn't about noise. It was about his race, his culture, and his right to exist in this space. Marcus decided to document everything. He photographed each note, kept detailed records of his practice times and volume levels, and began researching his rights as a tenant. He learned that Karen had made similar complaints about other Black and Latino residents over the years, though. Most had eventually moved out rather than fight the harassment. The situation reached a breaking point on a Saturday evening in January 2019. Marcus was working on a new song, a deeply personal track about his relationship with his absent father, when he heard aggressive knocking at his door. He lowered the volume immediately and opened the door to find Karen standing in the hallway, her face flushed with anger. "I've had enough of your noise," she announced loudly enough for other neighbors to hear. "Every day with this rap garbage. This is a respectable building, and we don't need your ghetto music disturbing people who actually contribute to society." Marcus tried to remain calm. "Ma'am, I practice during allowed hours and keep my volume low. I use headphones most of the—" "Don't lie to me," Karen shot back. "I know exactly what you're doing. You people always think you can just do whatever you want, playing your music as loud as you want, not caring about anyone else." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air like a slap. Other neighbors had begun to emerge from their apartments, drawn by Karen's raised voice. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being made into a spectacle, of having his existence turned into a public debate. "I'm following all building rules," Marcus said firmly but quietly. "If you have a complaint, you should take it up with building management." "I already did," Karen replied with a satisfied smile. "I told them all about your loud music and your friends coming and going at all hours." This was a lie. Marcus rarely had visitors and was extremely conscious about not disturbing others. "I also told them about the smell coming from your apartment." This new accusation, clearly implying drug use, was too much. Marcus felt his composure beginning to crack, but he forced himself to remain calm. "That's not true, and you know it." "We'll see what the landlord thinks," Karen said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling him right now to report this disturbance. And I'm recording this conversation so he can hear how aggressive you're being." She held up her phone, and Marcus realized she was live streaming to her social media accounts. Without his consent, his image and voice were being broadcast to her followers as she narrated a false story about being threatened by her aggressive neighbor. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Karen said to her phone camera while pointing at Marcus. "This is what happens when these people move into nice neighborhoods. They have no respect for anyone else, and when you ask them to be considerate, they get hostile and threatening." Marcus had never threatened anyone, but he understood the dangerous narrative being constructed. A young black man arguing with a white woman, being recorded and broadcast live. He knew how this story would be interpreted regardless of the truth. "I'm not being aggressive," Marcus said to the camera, hoping to set the record straight. "I'm just trying to practice my music during appropriate hours." "See how he talks back?" Karen continued her commentary. "This is what we have to deal with. I've been nothing but patient, asking nicely for months, and this is the thanks I get." Marcus stepped back into his apartment and closed the door, but he could hear Karen continuing her performance in the hallway, talking to her phone about feeling unsafe and threatened by her neighbor. He sat on his couch, trembling with anger and frustration, as the full weight of the situation settled over him. Within hours, Karen's live stream had been shared hundreds of times across social media platforms. The narrative she had crafted: hard-working woman being harassed by an aggressive black neighbor who played loud music and showed no respect for others, spread rapidly through local community groups and beyond. But Karen had made one crucial mistake. In her eagerness to document Marcus's alleged aggression, she had also recorded her own words, including her use of "you people" and her false accusations. She had created a permanent record of her own, BIS and harassment, not realizing that the very technology she thought would vindicate her would ultimately expose her. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The injustice of the situation, the humiliation of being characterized as a threat for simply existing in his own home, and the powerlessness he felt in the face of Karen's lies consumed his thoughts. But as dawn broke over Oakland, Marcus realized he had something Karen didn't: a platform, a voice, and a story that needed to be told. He sat down at his keyboard and began to play. The days following Karen's live stream were among the darkest in Marcus's life. The video had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by commentary that ranged from supportive to viciously racist. Local Facebook groups buzzed with debates about problem tenants and neighborhood decline, with many commenters taking Karen's version of events at face value. Marcus found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from strangers who felt entitled to judge his character based on a manipulated narrative. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Marcus, who had always been careful about his public image and took pride in being a positive representative of his community, now found himself portrayed as a stereotype, the aggressive black man who couldn't follow simple rules. He stopped making music entirely for 2 weeks, unable to bear the thought of giving Karen more ammunition for her complaints. His mother Sandra visited frequently during this period, bringing groceries and emotional support. She had lived through the civil rights era and recognized the patterns Marcus was experiencing. "Baby, this isn't about your music," she told him one evening as they sat in his living room. "This is about a woman who can't stand to see a young black man succeeding in a space she thinks belongs to her. Don't you dare let her steal your gift." But the harassment was escalating beyond just the social media attention. Marcus began receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours, sometimes heavy breathing, sometimes racial slurs, sometimes threats. Someone spray-painted THUG on his car windshield. His landlord, Mr. Rodriguez, called to discuss noise complaints and suggested that Marcus might be happier in a different building. The message was clear: leave voluntarily or face eviction proceedings. Marcus realized he needed help beyond what his family could provide. He reached out to the Oakland Tenants Union and connected with Kaisha Martinez, a housing rights advocate who had dealt with similar cases of racial harassment disguised as neighbor disputes. Kaisha explained that what Marcus was experiencing was part of a broader pattern of gentrification-related harassment designed to force out longtime residents and discourage new residents of color. The beautiful thing about Karen's live stream, Kaisha pointed out during their first meeting, is that she documented her own bias. She made statements that clearly show this isn't about noise, it's about race and class. That gives us legal options. Together, they developed a multi-pronged strategy. First, they would file a formal complaint with the building management company, documenting all instances of harassment and demanding action. Second, they would report Karen's behavior to local civil rights organizations. Third, and most importantly for Marcus's long-term well-being, they would help him reclaim his narrative. Kaisha suggested that Marcus consider sharing his own version of the story publicly. Right now, her lies are the only version people have heard, she explained. You have a platform through your music. Maybe it's time to use it. The idea terrified Marcus. Speaking out publicly would mean inviting even more scrutiny and potentially more harassment. But remaining silent felt like allowing Karen's lies to define him. He began working with Kaisha and a local filmmaker named David Chun to document his experience, creating a video that would provide context for what had really happened. Meanwhile, Marcus slowly began returning to his music, but now with a different purpose. The songs he wrote during this period were raw and angry, processing emotions he had never allowed himself to fully express. He wrote about the exhaustion of code switching, the weight of representing his entire race in white spaces, and the particular pain of being criminalized in his own home. His friend and fellow musician Tony Washington became a crucial collaborator during this period. Tony, who had experienced similar harassment in his own apartment building, helped Marcus channel his anger into artistic expression rather than self-destruction. "They want us to be angry," Tony observed during one late-night studio session. "But they want us to be angry in a way that confirms their stereotypes. Our job is to be angry in a way that changes minds." The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that his experience with Karen represented something much larger than a neighbor dispute. As he researched his situation, he discovered that noise complaints were one of the most common ways that racial harassment manifested in urban areas. Black and Latino residents faced noise complaints at rates far higher than their white neighbors, often for activities that would be ignored when white residents engaged in them. Marcus began connecting with other artists who had faced similar situations. He discovered a network of musicians, particularly hip-hop artists, who had been targeted by neighbors, landlords, and even local authorities for their music. Their stories followed remarkably similar patterns. Initial complaints that seemed race-neutral but escalated to explicitly biased harassment. Social media campaigns designed to humiliate and isolate them, and pressure to relocate or abandon their artistic pursuits. This revelation transformed Marcus's understanding of his situation. He wasn't just fighting for his right to live in his apartment. He was fighting for the right of black artists everywhere to create without being criminalized. The song that began to emerge from this period wasn't just about Karen Mitchell. It was about every Karen who had ever tried to silence black voices through weaponized complaints and false narratives. The music that flowed from Marcus during this period was unlike anything he had created before. Gone were the careful, radio-friendly melodies he had crafted while trying to build a mainstream career. These new songs were urgent, uncompromising, and deeply personal. They spoke to experiences that mainstream media rarely acknowledged, but that resonated powerfully with anyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in their own community. As word spread through Oakland's artistic community about what Marcus was experiencing, support began to mobilize. Local musicians organized benefit concerts to help with his legal expenses. Community activists included his story in broader conversations about housing justice and racial equity. Most importantly, other residents of his building, particularly the Latino families who had also been targets of Karen's complaints, began speaking up about their own experiences. Marcus realized that his struggle had become larger than himself, but he also understood that he was uniquely positioned to give it a voice that could reach beyond his immediate community. The song taking shape in his studio would need to be more than just personal expression. It would need to be a rallying cry. The transformation began on a rainy Tuesday evening in March 2019. Marcus sat in his apartment, surrounded by months of documented harassment, legal paperwork, and half-finished songs that captured his rage, but didn't yet channel it effectively. He had been working with Kaisha Martinez and his legal team to build a case against Karen's harassment, but the process felt slow and uncertain. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign, now emboldened by online supporters who praised her for standing up to thugs in her neighborhood. That evening, Marcus received a text message from his mother that would change everything. Sandra had been visiting her sister in Sacramento when she overheard a conversation at the grocery store. Two white women discussing Karen's viral video with approval, talking about how certain types of people needed to be kept in line. One of them mentioned wanting to share the video with friends as an example of how to handle problem neighbors. "Baby," Sandra texted, Your story's being used to hurt other people like us. That woman isn't just trying to silence you. She's teaching others how to do the same thing. You need to sing louder than her lies." That night, Marcus experienced what he would later describe as a moment of perfect clarity. All the separate elements of his struggle, the harassment, the legal battle, the community support, and his artistic voice suddenly crystallized into a single powerful vision. He sat down at his keyboard and began playing a melody that had been haunting him for weeks, but now the words came pouring out with unstoppable force. The song that emerged, Karen's Complaint, was unlike anything in Marcus's previous catalog. It opened with a sample from Karen's own live stream, her voice saying, "You people always think you can just do whatever you want," transformed into a haunting musical motif. Over a deep, driving beat, Marcus crafted verses that systematically dismantled every aspect of Karen's narrative while exposing the broader system of racial harassment it represented. "She said I'm too loud, but she never heard my dreams, said I don't belong. But this is my neighborhood scene. Filed complaints on my music, but the real noise is her hate. Tried to write me out the story, but I'm changing my own fate." Marcus rapped in the opening verse, his voice carrying both pain and defiance. The chorus became an anthem of resistance. "Karen's got a complaint, but I got something to say about every Karen trying to drive us away. You can call the police. You can live stream your lies, but we're not going nowhere. Watch our voices multiply." What made the song extraordinary wasn't just its musical craftsmanship. No, Marcus had never produced anything more sophisticated, but its strategic approach to storytelling. Each verse addressed different aspects of racial harassment, while maintaining universal themes that could resonate beyond just his specific situation. The bridge featured recorded testimonies from other residents who had experienced Karen's harassment, creating a chorus of voices that validated Marcus's experience while proving it wasn't isolated, working 18-hour days. Marcus completed the song in just over a week, but he knew that releasing it independently wouldn't be enough to counter the viral spread of Karen's lies. He needed a platform that could match her reach. Through connections in Oakland's music scene, he arranged to premiere Karen's Complaint at a community concert organized by local housing rights activists. The premiere took place on a Saturday evening at the Paramount Theater in downtown Oakland. What began as a small community event transformed into something much larger as word spread through social media. Local news outlets, drawn by the controversy surrounding Marcus's situation, sent reporters to cover what they expected to be minor community gathering. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented. When Marcus took the stage and began performing Karen's Complaint, the audience of nearly 2,000 people erupted in recognition. Here was their experience, the daily microaggressions, the weaponized complaints, the exhaustion of having to justify their existence, transformed into art that was both beautiful and uncompromising. The performance was streamed live on multiple platforms, and within hours, clips were circulating across social media. But this time, the narrative was different. Instead of a manipulated story about a problem tenant, viewers saw a young artist transforming harassment into powerful social commentary, supported by a community that recognized and validated his experience. The song's impact was immediate and profound. Local radio stations began playing it despite its explicit content about racism. National hip-hop blogs picked up the story, framing it as an example of how artists could respond to discrimination through their craft. Most importantly, other victims of similar harassment began sharing their own stories, using Marcus's song as a framework for discussing their experiences. Karen Mitchell, who had been riding high on her viral fame, suddenly found herself on the defensive. Her social media accounts, once flooded with supportive comments, now faced scrutiny from people who had heard Marcus's side of the story. The very platforms she had used to amplify her harassment were now being used to hold her accountable. But the real climax came when Marcus realized that his song had become something larger than revenge or even justice. It had become a tool for community building and systematic change. Within 6 months of Coren's complaint going viral, Marcus Williams found himself at the center of a movement he never intended to create. The song, which had begun as personal catharsis, became a rallying cry for communities across the country dealing with similar patterns of racialized harassment. By September 2019, it had accumulated over 50 million streams across all platforms and had been featured in dozens of news articles about housing discrimination and the weaponization of noise complaints against residents of color. The legal resolution of Marcus's case proved to be both swift and comprehensive once his story gained national attention. Building management, facing intense public scrutiny and potential legal liability, terminated Coren Mitchell's lease for violations of harassment policies that had previously gone unenforced. An investigation revealed that Coren had made similar complaints about 7 other residents over her 8 years in the building, all of them Black or Latino, while never once complaining about noise from white neighbors. More importantly, the building management company implemented new policies designed to prevent discriminatory harassment, including mandatory bias training for staff and clear procedures for investigating complaint patterns that might indicate racial targeting. These changes were adopted by other property management companies throughout the Bay Area, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond Marcus's individual case. Coren herself faced significant consequences for her harassment campaign. Her employer, citing the viral video as evidence of racial bias that could affect her work with diverse clients, terminated her employment. She faced civil rights violations charges filed by the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, resulting in a settlement that included financial compensation for Marcus and a requirement that she complete extensive bias training. Perhaps most significantly, her attempt to use social media to destroy Marcus's reputation ultimately destroyed her own, as employers and community members associated her name permanently with racial harassment. But the most meaningful resolution for Marcus came through the community that formed around his story. Coren's complaint sparked the creation of the Oakland Music Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization that provides legal support and advocacy for artists facing housing discrimination. Marcus became a board member and spokesperson, using his platform to support other musicians dealing with similar harassment, while also working with policymakers to address the systemic issues his case had exposed. The song's success also transformed Marcus's career in ways he had never imagined. Record labels that had previously shown little interest in his music now courted him aggressively, recognizing both his artistic talent and his ability to address social issues through his work. Rather than signing with a major label, Marcus chose to maintain his independence while partnering with organizations that shared his commitment to social justice. His follow-up album, Neighborhood Watch, explored themes of community, resistance, and belonging while maintaining the musical sophistication that had made Coren's complaint so powerful. The album debuted at number 12 on the Billboard 200 and earned Marcus his first Grammy nomination for Best Rap Album. More importantly for Marcus, it demonstrated that artists could address serious social issues without compromising their artistic integrity or commercial appeal. The impact extended beyond music into policy and legal precedent. Marcus's case was cited in several successful housing discrimination lawsuits across the country, establishing important precedents about how noise complaints could be used as evidence of racial harassment. The Department of Housing and Urban Development referenced his story in new guidance about recognizing and addressing discriminatory complaint patterns in federally subsidized housing. Educational institutions began incorporating Marcus's story into curricula about contemporary civil rights issues, media literacy, and the power of artistic expression in social movements. High schools and colleges across the country invited him to speak about his experience, leading to hundreds of conversations with young people about recognizing and responding to racial discrimination in their own lives. 3 years after the initial incident, Marcus still lives in the same Oakland apartment where Karen Mitchell once tried to silence his music. But now, instead of practicing in fearful isolation, he hosts monthly community concerts in the building's courtyard, bringing together neighbors for celebrations that strengthen rather than divide their shared space. The events, which feature local artists and community organizations, have become models for how music can build bridges rather than walls between different communities. Marcus's relationship with his neighbors has been transformed completely. Where once he felt like an unwelcome presence, he now serves as a bridge between different generations and ethnicities within the building. Older residents share stories of their own experiences with discrimination, while newer residents learn about the neighborhood's history and character. Marcus Williams never set out to become a symbol of resistance against racial harassment. He just wanted to make music in the comfort of his own home. But sometimes, history chooses us rather than the other way around, and Marcus's response to Karen Mitchell's harassment became a masterclass in turning oppression into opportunity, pain into power, and individual struggle into collective action. Karen's complaint did more than just counter one woman's lies. It exposed a pattern of discrimination that affects millions of people across America. By documenting his experience and transforming it into art, Marcus created a template that others could follow when facing similar harassment. He proved that the victims of racial discrimination don't have to suffer in silence or simply endure abuse until they're forced to leave. They can fight back, speak out, and use their voices to create change. The song's lasting impact extends far beyond its commercial success or the legal precedents it established. It demonstrated the power of authentic storytelling in combating false narratives, the importance of community support in resisting individual harassment, and the potential for art to serve as both personal healing and social justice tool. Today, when someone searches for Karen Mitchell's name online, they don't find a triumphant story of a woman who successfully harassed her black neighbor into silence. Instead, they find a cautionary tale about how attempts to weaponize racial bias can backfire spectacularly when confronted with courage, community support, and creative resistance. Marcus continues to make music, but now he does so with the knowledge that his voice carries the hopes and struggles of countless others who have faced similar discrimination. His story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response to hate isn't silence or submission. It's singing loud enough for the whole world to hear. In the end, Karen got exactly what she complained about. Marcus's music became impossible to ignore. She just never imagined it would be, because the entire world was listening.